Hello, and welcome to the Unassuming Podcast. I'm your host, Karen Fallon, and on today's episode, we're going to be examining our beliefs and challenging our assumptions around lying. More specifically, is lying part of human nature? Is it unavoidable? So with me, I have two amazing people as my guests, an old friend and a new friend. Charles Feltman has been coaching executives and other leaders, leading trust building workshops and speaking on trust, team effectiveness, and leadership for over 25 years. He is the author of The Thin Book of Trust, an essential primer for building trust at work. And Winkle Giulioni is an author, consultant, trainer, and speaker who helps organizations tap their only sustainable competitive advantage, talent. One of Inc. magazine's top 100 speakers, she's the co-author of the international bestseller, Help Them Grow or Watch Them Go, and the author of Promotions Are So Yesterday, Redefine Career Development and Help Employees Thrive. So welcome today. And I just want to start us off with what prompted this question. I used to believe growing up that lying was the deviant behavior, that people were basically truthful and that lying took more energy because you had to remember your lie. But as I get older, I see that lying is a very natural thing for us to do, and evolution sometimes rewards deception. Animals that can deceive others are more likely to survive and thrive. But on the other hand, many people today talk about living in the post-truth world. One, I don't know if that's true. Are we ever living in a truthful world? And we could see the harm that it's doing. Nobody believes what's coming from the White House. Nobody believes what's coming from the press. So I'd like to spend some time with you two talking about lying. And I think the first thing I want to start off with is maybe we should define what lying is. Julie.
Karen, I've been thinking about this a lot since you invited me into this conversation. And, the big lies are obvious. I mean, we know what those are, the absolute, the really clear, obvious untruths. But the more I thought about it, the more I saw this insidious way that lies really are just such a pervasive part of our human experience. The white lies that we engage in, I'll personalize it, that I engage in on a regular basis. What a lovely gift, or those jeans don't make you look fat, or it's fine when the eggs are really overcooked. The kind of the social lubricant almost lies that we engage in occurred to me. But then there was like this whole other question that I started to play with in my own mind about what about the withholding of information that we do? Is that a lie in a way? And then, of course, the selective truths, the way we pick and choose and frame information in a way that at best, serves our purposes, and at worst, it's kind of misleading. So for me, really just even thinking about having this conversation opened me up to this whole world of lies that we find ourselves in. Charles, about you though? You write about trust. How are you defining lies?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. Because, also in the lead up to having this conversation, I've been thinking a lot about it, and then really thinking partly about how, going back to my own childhood, I, told stories, right? And some of those stories didn't match probably other people's version of reality, of what actually happened. And I told those stories sometimes to make an impression, sometimes to get out of punishment in certain cases, those kinds of things. So children really fabricate stuff all the time. And as we grow older, ideally, we kind of do that less and less. So when I'm talking, like when I'm working with a group of people around a team or something around trust, and I talk about being honest, or, I don't necessarily not say not lying, but I do talk about it as the conversation in your head being different from the one you're having with me externally is a form of dishonesty. So in other words, I know that I'm thinking something different than what I'm actually saying.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens when we do that? And we usually do it for a reason, might not be the the best of reasons, but we usually do it for some reason that has to do with either ego enhancement or getting out of a negative consequence. The problem with it is that if it gets discovered in some way, we break trust. And so that's how I think about it primarily, is when lies damage trust in some way. If you look at surveys and stuff, we've lost a lot of trust. The media has lost trust. Politicians have, we've lost trust in our politicians. We've lost trust in many areas of our life. Social trust is fraying at the edges. And a lot of it has to do with lying, or the perception of lying, that somebody is lying to me. And the question that comes up for me at that point is, why? What is it about someone lying to me that is such a trigger for me and for most of us, that we're ready to cut that person out of our lives if we think they've lied to us?
And that's really interesting because, on one hand, we're lying every day about, whether the eggs are overcooked or the jeans make you look fat kind of thing. And I think we have an expectation that people are going to be gracious and lie like that. But then there seems to be a line. And I'm wondering if that line is the lie intended to benefit the person who's lying or benefit the person who's being lied to?
I love that distinction, because I started to, think about what's my red line that I won't step over. And I'll tell you, I will admit, you might look fat in those jeans, and I'm not going to tell you. I I want to be kind and not hurt feelings. And so I recognize, and again, just thinking about this conversation, I was aware of those times when kindness trumped the truth. And so it forced me to really think, what's my red line? Like, when will I not depart from what is honest here? And it strikes me that where it comes down for me is, I'm not going to lie if it means I'm going to enjoy some kind of unjust gain, or if I'm going to offload harm to someone else. And so it fits right into what you were saying. Is it about not hurting others versus helping, others, and then actively hurting others? That's where I think the lie falls into that kind of danger zone.
I'm curious, though, in thinking about even those sort of lies of kindness. If I think about that, what comes up often, if I really take a look at it and look internally, is it being kind to the other person, or is it that I don't want to be perceived as unkind? I'm sort of managing perceptions about myself here. And is there a way that I could, if I really thought about it, is there a way that I could say that something to someone that is both honest and also takes care of them in some way? That takes work to actually think about it, right? And it's often easier to just offer the little lie anywhere. Oh, it really doesn't matter. It's okay. Than to go through the work of thinking of a way to say it that takes care of them and at the same time is honest. But I do think often, for me anyway, if I'm thinking about lying, or actually I do sprinkle in those small lies, it's really about, in large part, protecting me from being self-assessing, and maybe for the other person assessing I'm an unkind person, or I'm a, whatever kind of person.
Sure.
So I'm just curious about that. What is that? What happens when I say that?
When you were talking, what came to my mind is my parents were never the kind of parents to just, feed me with compliments. Well, you know how like parents are always trying to build self-esteem and you get the participation trophies. My parents were none of that. I mean, there was none of that. But I knew that when they gave me a compliment, that it was really true, that I had done something deserving of that compliment. So, in a way, they were a little unkind because I felt like I was never getting the recognition or the, reward from them. But on the other hand, I knew they really meant it, that it was not just something they were saying. So, I think that goes back to the kindness and the trust. I could trust what they were saying all the time because I knew they wouldn't lie to me. I felt it was a little unkind because other kids were getting praised and I wasn't. And I don't know where I netted out. I think where I netted out with that experience is I think they did the right thing by not giving me gratuitous compliments.
It's interesting as you're talking, Karen, to think about the role that parents probably play in setting the terms for our relationship with the truth. Um, and how we see that model and then our own personal experience of being on the receiving end of it, really kind of creates the foundation from which we may operate relative to how we package the messages that we give to others.
Yeah, I think our parents have a huge role in that in our early experience in our families. That's where we learn to trust. However, whatever we learn about trust and building trust and trusting other people, we learn it there.
Yeah.
We learn whether it's safe to trust or not. We learn how to lie, I think, as well as learn how to tell the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in my household, Karen, you're talking about your household, you would get, you'd get unvarnished truth, which which is valuable for you or was valuable, it turns out, for you. And I think in my household, that was very similar. My parents didn't compliment me around things that they didn't feel were honest compliments. But also, interestingly, in my family, there were secrets that they were in the background, and we didn't know them, didn't hear about them, but they eventually came out. So I know they were there, and I think as children, both my sister and I could feel them, could feel the places where my parents didn't want to go.
Oh.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Charles, because I think I grew up in a really gentler environment. My parents were pretty generous in terms of self-esteem building, but we too, had the issues and the secrets, under the surface. And so when I had kids, I knew that I had some skill building to do in this arena. And I remember talking to a child psychologist to try to really understand, like, how do we as parents instill the right kind of values? And I remember one person talking about how easy it is for us as parents to teach our kids to lie, to set the conditions, to back them into corners. So their natural response, kind of Karen, back to what you were saying, like survival, evolution is, I got to lie to get out of this. And it was so interesting because one person shared this way of framing honesty. And I remember it so vividly. She said, so frequently when we talk to our kids about honesty, it's about being good. Honesty is about being a good boy or girl. And she reframed it in terms of honesty is how we stay connected. It's how we stay safe. It's how we stay, trusted by one another and remain as a solid family. And I thought it was just such a beautiful reframing from this judgment, good, bad thing to framing it in terms of the human benefits that can come from the honesty that we experience with one another.
Yeah, I really like that.
Yeah.
That sounds like a really good way to frame it. for parents. Again, it's that space of raising children who can be successful and effective in the world. I want to say being an effective or a good adult, a good member of society. There are a lot of choices we have to make around how much we share, how much truth we offer. When you kind of don't tell all of the truth, you offer something, but don't fill it all in. Think about it in terms of what's the impact. What's the impact on me by withholding certain information? And also, what's the impact on the other people? Sometimes it's appropriate to withhold information because it's going to get in the way. Talking about being transparent to leaders, to be transparent, it builds trust. It's a good thing, but not always. Sometimes some information it's better to keep private for now because it's potentially going to be a problem, or there's a commitment to someone else to not share that information with these people or this person. So is that lying, or is that something else? And how do we make that distinction for ourselves?
That's a really good point, and I love that whole reframing with the connectedness, because as you were talking about that, and I was thinking about trust, Charles, I was thinking there's an element of vulnerability involved in this, and I think part of deception is to protect ourselves. And I think if you have a very open and honest relationship with someone, that requires a lot of vulnerability. You have to, like, this is who I really am. This is me with my flaws and my insecurities. And I think normally we would keep that to ourselves. I can imagine someone in a leadership position doesn't want to overshare about their personal life because that's just not the right context for that. And some of these things can, I think, change the image of the person to something other than what it should be. Like, I'm having all these thoughts going through my head about the narratives we tell ourselves and making up stories, and children making up stories, which was something we said earlier. And then leadership has to tell stories. And all this stuff is really related. The whole deception and stories we tell ourselves and what we want to project to the world. And it seems like, are there certain guidelines, do you think, that we need to follow about when we need to be honest and when we shouldn't be honest, or when it's okay to lie, but when we absolutely positively need to tell the truth?
Well, I think what Julie you said before about that, reframing it as connection, as truth-telling being part of staying connected. I don't think there are hard and fast rules around it so much as what's my North Star, what's my guiding principle for myself in life. One of the things that I think is important is to be honest with myself. If I start lying to myself, then it's really easy to lie to other people. So I think kind of the hard line for me is taking a look at when I might be not being honest with myself and reining that in, taking an honest look at what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, what I'm saying, and being able to then make an assessment. Okay, that's my own internal honesty meter. It's okay it's in the right place right now. And then from there, for the sake of what would I want to tell a different story to someone else? Is there a good reason? Is it good enough according to my own set of values? Rather than having a set of rules around that, is it?
Yeah. And, Charles, as you're talking, I'm struck by maybe a filter through which to run the decision of what to say and what not to say, relative to the truth, really has to do with the motivation that you're bringing to the interaction. So if I'm lying to save face, or if I'm lying to, I don't know, protect my status, or to get something that really isn't mine. Those sorts of cases, that to me feels like a really a really obvious trigger that no, those situations where I'm I'm lying to avoid unnecessary discomfort. I think sometimes we skirt the truth because we don't want to deal with whatever the discomfort is. So that probably is another trigger that, okay, I need to rethink my approach here.
I just wanted to sum up my understanding of what we've said is that a lot of it has to do with our motivations. Are we lying to get something? We're lying for our own benefit, or are we lying for someone else's benefit? And that's an important distinction. And I can see lies actually as a useful tool. And I'm just reminded of a situation where my husband took me climbing with our kids, and I'm afraid of heights, and the kids were loving it and he was loving it. And I was not having it. And he's like, we're almost there. We're almost there. And we were not almost there. But But at the end of the day, I was really glad that he lied to me because I made
Yeah.
it and I stretched beyond myself. And if he had been truthful, I would have said, yeah, you go on ahead and I'll sit here. So I know there are certain ethicists that'll say, you should tell people that they look fat in those jeans, but do it in a nicer way. But I'm just thinking in that situation, that lie was really, really appropriate. And I think it's a tool that we can use, but we have to examine ourselves and and why we're using that tool or why we shouldn't using that tool. Would you say that that's
Yeah.
an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
his motivation for helping, offering you that lie was so pure. And he knew that you wanted to get to the end of the hike with everybody. I take no exception to that.
Yeah. And, he wasn't necessarily lying. He was just telling you that the end was near, and near is relative.
Almost is relative.
It's like reminds me of a wonderful backpacking film I saw many years ago called Mile, Mile and a Half, which is a common thing that people say. You meet somebody, you're going up, over a big pass, and you run into somebody and you say, well, how far? And they say, "Oh, about a mile, mile and a half." A mile and a half later, you're looking up and going, oh no. But they get you to that next level. They get you to that next place. Yeah. So for the sake of what? Am I um, thinking about saying something that I know is different from accurate version of reality, or a more accurate version of reality? And is my motivation self-serving? Is it really going to serve someone else? Uh, and I think we right now in our society and in our country, and I think throughout the world, we're seeing a real uptick in self-serving lying.
Can I ask about that? I've been reflecting on that. And I wonder, do you think that we are seeing an uptick? Or do you think that the communication vehicles, the speed with which things can get around, that we're just able to see more of the lies that maybe weren't as visible to us in the past?
It's- That's a great question, and
Mm.
I don't know the answer to it, certainly. But I think it would be worth kind of considering, was this the case, 20, 30, 50, 80, 100 years ago? Um, and what really worries me is that we can now lie with something that looks like the truth. That with AI, we can create, or we can take something that is an actual, like a video, and alter it so that it tells a different story, which is really concerning to me, especially for people who are prone to lying for their own purposes and have access to the tools to do it increasingly effectively.
I think it's both. I look back on my childhood and my parents again, and how they really believed everything. Like my mother said, well, if I read it in the newspaper, it has to be true, and I laughed. So I was like, no, doesn't have to be true. So I think we're more savvy about it and we recognize that people are lying to us. Because I think about the Vietnam War and how many lies the government issued about the Vietnam War, and people were not aware of that at all. And I think when the truth came out, when we got into other wars, that people were more suspect. How many lies are we being told about the Iraq war? Well, the weapons of mass destruction were, that was a lie. So I think that we're becoming more aware of it. We're a little bit more sophisticated as an audience. But I also see that as a vicious circle, like as people become more sophisticated and they expect people to lie, that, oh, it's okay for me to lie because people should know that I'm lying and people should know the difference between lying and not lying. And it goes on and on and on. Like, what was that case with was it Fox News or the other network? And they said, well, people should know that this isn't news, this is entertainment.
Well, and it makes me wonder. I agree, we're more savvy, but that the danger here is in such a polarized place where we're so committed to our confirmation bias that we gather up, we're attracted to, in many cases, those lies that bolster our position. And so the lies, maybe they're more frequent, maybe they're not, but they almost take on greater power, it feels like today.
Yeah, I mean, I just think about myself. I read stuff that fits with my perspective of things, and I'm much more willing to accept that, less willing to really dig in and say, "Is this true?" But it also drives me nuts that I feel that way. So I really do try and dig into stuff and see as best I can how accurate it is, how honest it is. But yeah, I think that's certainly at a social level, at a community wide, countrywide level. People were obviously, as you say, Karen, in retrospect, people were and the government were lying, just bold-faced lying about the war in Vietnam, probably Korean War before that, certainly same thing in Iraq. But it seems like today that lies in the face of obvious evidence to the contrary, people are holding on to and maintaining what I would call a lie. That's just, obviously not true. We can see it with our own eyes. But the idea is, and this has been around for a long time, that you repeat that enough. And eventually people just kind of go, okay, well, I'll just go with it because I've heard it 1,000 times.
Well, and just the framing, was it Kellyanne Conway who came up with alternative facts?
Mm.
Just that framing normalizes or makes more acceptable what we would consider a lie.
It also normalizes that you can have your set of facts and I can have my set of facts. And so what settles that ultimately? Power. Whoever has the most power gets to assert their set of facts and make those the accepted facts, which again is really disturbing to me.
Wow. Yeah. I never thought about that, but that makes so much sense, and why certain institutions and people feel that they can lie with impunity because they're not subject to the rules the rest of us have to follow.
And that's the
Well,
real danger, right? I mean, occasional personal lies? That's one thing. Is when organizations industrialize the deception like this in an environment where that information can be spread so quickly and indiscriminately. That's where it feels really dangerous to me.
yeah, I mean, I feel it in my body that this is very worrisome to me. At the same time, in everyday life, where do I go with truth, lying, trust? Because I work with people all the time around building trust. And generally speaking, I say one of the things that can damage trust real fast is lying, telling not the truth. And most people get it. They're down with that in the business world, in the world of organizations. And yet it still happens. How do I prepare for it and deal with it? And how do I help other people prepare for and deal with it?
Well, I'm of the belief that I think we need to have our own standards. Like you talked about it yourself, Charles, looking at yourself in the mirror and are you lying to yourself? And I see in a local political basis, the more readily acceptance of lies, I think, due to the environment that we're in. And as someone who's worked in organizational change, I'm a big believer in bottom up change. I don't think the top down really works very well, because there's so many levels of resistance. But, when things were working at the bottom, it's very easy to topple what's at the top. So my answer, and maybe it's a question to see what you think, is, perhaps if we had our own standards around the truth and being truthful with other people and being aware that truth is required for trust and it's required for connectedness, but lies can be a tool, being more mindful of that on a personal basis and on a relationship basis. I mean, do you think that there's a way that can trickle upwards?
I sure do. I mean, I think when each of us finds whatever our center is, when we become better, both truth tellers and maybe truth trackers at the same time, we model that. And that's how humans learn. It's by watching one another and picking up on those sorts of things. So, and then, yeah, I think also, even as individuals, when we can come to a situation and say, I don't know, or I was wrong, or I need more time, I think when we can model the ways of connecting with people and connecting with the truth that we want to share, that like any other positive example is going to spread.
Yes, absolutely. Especially the space of vulnerability around, I don't know, I don't have the answer. Leaders often, at least when they start out, they have the idea that they're supposed to have all the answers to everything. They're the ones who are supposed to know. And the good ones, the ones who become really effective leaders, figure that out, that they are not supposed to know about everything. And so they can make themselves vulnerable and say, I don't know. I need to look deeper into this, or I need help. You're my team. Help me out. Help us out. Let's do this together. And that actually builds trust and connection both at the same time.
And that's curious because as you were talking about vulnerability and leadership, I said, but, it does require trust because sometimes when, you're vulnerable like that, you're giving your power away, right? Or are you giving your power
Oh, I
away?
disagree.
Okay.
I think
It's stepping into your power.
yeah, you're amplifying your power.
Yeah.
Because you talked before about who dominates. Maybe power's not the right word. Maybe you're giving away your ability to dominate?
Maybe you're giving away your capacity for power over. Yeah.
But you're
The power over.
growing your power with
Mm.
and your ability
Yes.
to influence through, which is a more sustainable power source, if you will.
Yes. I would completely agree with that.
So what I'm getting from this, and I'm glad you guys disagreed with me on the power, is I'm thinking competition versus cooperation. And if you have that competition mindset or scarcity mindset, you need to win, you want to dominate. But if you have the cooperation mindset, and there's enough for everybody, then you gain more and you gain more power by being vulnerable.
And I think there's a place for competition, and it's not nearly as sustainable as collaboration and cooperation in the long run. Using both, thinking about and using lying as a tool, you can use cooperation, you can use competition as tools towards an end. The end is going to be different depending on what tools you use. Keeping that in mind as you set out. Julie, you started out defining lying for us. Is there anything, now that we've had this conversation and kind of gone through some different versions of lying and why do we lie and all of that, is there anything that has changed for you about your definition? Or
Oh, it's interesting.
You want to add to that definition?
Yeah, you know what I really am taking away from the conversation, Charles, is the focus that you had on looking in the mirror and figuring out sort of what is your reason for sharing the truth or not, and is it about you? Is it about them? Which I think is just such a lovely kind of guiding principle for probably for everything we do with other people, right? When we're talking about, lying and sharing truthful information and whatnot, but probably in all of our interactions in the world as humans or as leaders, it really does come down to, are my actions in service of me or are they in service of others? And when we lean into the latter, obviously the outcomes for everyone are better.
Yeah, I guess I'm also recognizing that concept of lying as a tool and how you can use it to accomplish some particular end. And again, asking for the sake of what do I want to accomplish this particular end? Is it about me? Is it about really serving someone else? And so if I'm using that tool well, that's something that I want to do sometimes, recognizing there's a risk.
Mm.
And just like using a particular kind of saw that has the capacity to knock something back at you, split your lip. There's kind of going back to something else that you were saying, Julie, also that came up for me as I was listening to you just now, is this idea that asking that question, looking yourself in the mirror, asking that question for the sake of what am I doing this? And you come back with the answer, oh, it's really about me, not about them. That opens the door for me when that happens, when I recognize that it's about me. Really looking inside, what is it that is being served by this for me? And is that something that I want to support, or I want to change, or I even knew was there in the first place? So it's also a great tool for, individual learning and growth.
Yeah. Yeah. For deeper self-awareness. That's a really good point.
So, I feel like, I learned a lot. I got a lot of insights. Um, I love how, we came to a realization, that, about connection, about self-reflection, what's our motivation. And, I'm really curious too, Charles, when you mentioned about domination. I never thought about that, but the people who dominate, the winners get to write history. I guess that's that's always been the case. But I feel like if we are more mindful about how we lie and how we use lies and maybe make an effort to be more truthful in our relationships so we can establish those connections, that would go an awful long way to helping what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
Well said.
There is a positive influx. It does
Mm.
flow out from us, and we can be examples ourselves of what we want other people, what we want to see in the world. Thanks for that.
Mm.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation. Thank you, Karen, for inviting it.
So
Well,
fun.
yes, it's been great. And thank you very much. And I've learned a great deal today.